Okay guys, we're under the Corvette because I'm actually going to show you how to swap the clutch on a C6 Corvette. So that's going to be an 05 to 2013 Corvette. Now, I actually already did the swap, so I'm kind of going back in reflection of how I did it, but I took a lot of pictures when I did the swap, so should be able to provide you enough of a visual guide for you guys to get through the swap, and also some tips and tricks that I found along the way. Now, I have the Corvette up on my 2-post max jacks lift. As you can see, I'm actually sitting on the ground. I'm sitting Indian style on the ground, so there's not a ton of room under here, but there's enough room for you to do a clutch swap with a C5 or a C6 Corvette. So hopefully I can give you enough information for you guys to do a clutch swap at home. Now, when I did this swap, I was actually in the middle. I was about to do the supercharger swap on the Corvette, the Edelbrock E-Force install, but what had happened was I needed to get to the fuel system. What had happened was I needed to get to the fuel system and install the Z06 fuel pump that comes with the E-Force kit. Now, you see this shield, this aluminum shield guard here and here. These are actually where the fuel tanks are. There's 2 tanks in the Corvette that's connected by a crossover tube that sits above the transmission and sits above the torque tube. So you got the exhaust, the transmission torque tube, then that crossover tube is sitting above that. So I had to take the car apart. I took the exhaust out. I was trying to get to the fuel pump, but I couldn't get to that damn crossover tube. And so what I ended up doing was I actually ended up dropping the entire drivetrain. So from the bell housing back, I took everything out. And the reason I did all that was because I needed to get the clearance to get that crossover tube out. Now, you necessarily don't need to take out the drivetrain, but I had worked on this. I'd taken the tank out like 3 times. I broke stuff and I was just sick of working on it, so I wanted to make it as simple and easy as I could. So what I ended up doing was deciding, since hell, I've got the car far enough apart, I'll just drop the torque tube and swap the clutch out at the same time. Okay guys, on the inside of the car for the clutch replacement, what you're going to have to do is actually take out the center console and the lid. The lid is held on with 4 torque spits. I'm not really sure the size, but they're small torque spits. I think it's like a T25. And the center console is actually only held in with 3, I think there's 7mm bolts on the inside of the center console. Open that. You take those 2 or 3 bolts out on the bottom, pull that out. Then you start pulling from the back, so lift up and pull out toward you, and eventually you'll loosen up the clips that hold the center console around the navigation and the HVAC system. You're going to unplug all that. You're going to unplug the wires for the seat heaters. Those are be back behind the ashtray that comes out with the assembly. And also you're going to disconnect the wiring for the traction control button. And also mine is an 05, so I have an airbag light that I have disconnected. There's going to be wiring for that you may have to disconnect if you're, depending on the model of your car. So take all that out. You're going to remove the center console itself, the carbon fiber gray part, leather part, remove that. And then under, you're going to have to remove the shift knob. That varies depending on the year. It's either a torque spit, or I think they all might be a torque spit, but it depends on the year. So disconnect the shift knob, pull that up. The shifter boot should stay with the console. That'll come up above the shift knob, and that will all come out. You've already disconnected all the electrical, so that'll be gone. Underneath the shift boot, you will have a foam pad underneath the console, underneath between the cup holder and the shifter. You're going to take that out. Underneath that, you're going to have a rubber shield, like splash shield, so it basically isolates the torque tube from the cabin. Lift that up and out. I think it's just clipped in. I don't remember there being a bolt. Remove that. Then you're going to get to the shifter, what I call the shifter box. Basically, what I mean by that, it's the knob, it's the rod, and it's the shifter lower assembly that the shift cable actually screws onto, that attaches to. So there's 4 bolts for the shift box. I believe they're 10mm bolts. Take those all out. There's 4 bolts for that. And then you'll be able to pull the shifter assembly forward. You're going to disconnect the shifter linkage. The shifter linkage is held on with a small bolt. I believe it's another 10 millimeter. Pull that out. You'll be able to pull the shifter linkage from the back of the shifter box. Pull the shifter box out of the car, set it on the floor or wherever, and that'll be it for what you need to disconnect on the interior. Now we can go to the front of the car and start working up there. Okay guys, to continue with the clutch swap, what you're going to want to do from the top of the car is actually take out the spark plugs on both sides as well as the headers. You want to take the spark plugs out because you need to take the plugs out to remove the headers without risking breaking the porcelain electrode off inside the cylinder head. So remove the spark plugs, use your spark plug removal tool, use your 3/8 ratchet wrench, and take all of them out. Also disconnect the spark plug wires, obviously. And you may take the coil packs out as well. I'm not really sure that's 100% necessary, but you're definitely going to want to take the spark plugs out to get to the headers, and then you want to take the header bolts out. And in this case, I've got the ARP header bolts, so it's not going to be a standard, I think it's a 10 millimeter bolt. These are going to be different because they're 12 point instead of the standard 6 point. So take your spark plug wires out, take the header, disconnect it from the top of the motor, and then you're also going to want to take off the O2 sensor, but you should be able to get the front O2 sensor from the bottom. On the driver's side, it's going to be the same ordeal. Take out the spark plugs with your spark plug removal tool, with your 3/8 wrench, disconnect the spark plug wires, then take out the header bolts, and you should be good to go. Also on the driver's side, you're going to have to disconnect the slave cylinder from the master cylinder. You can see it down here. I'm going to point to it with the flashlight. It's right here, that round tube. Pull that foam back, and there's going to be a retaining clip connecting the slave cylinder to the master cylinder. The reason you're going to want to do this now is because once you get the car up in the air, you're not going to be able to reach it. So you need to deal with the car on the ground. So disconnect the slave cylinder from the master cylinder, remove it's just like one of those E-clips. Pull that out. Don't lose it because those are hard to come by. And you should be good to go. Now also, you can see I have the tick speed bleeder for the master slave cylinder right here. I have that already installed, but that's going to be, we're going to get to that when we get the car apart. Now there is a bolt, I'm just not sure we can see it. There's actually a bolt holding the slave cylinder to the back of the bell housing. And actually, yeah, I can see it. I'm not sure if you'll be able to see it on the camera. It's going to be sideways, but there's an upper bell housing bolt that has a bracket on it. That 90-degree bracket actually holds the slave cylinder. So we'll eventually get to that when we are under the car and we can disconnect the slave cylinder. So there's going to be a bell housing bolt eventually. And also while we're back here, you can see the O2 sensor socket, the plug for it. Disconnect the plug. So you can do that on both sides. But that's pretty much going to be it for the top end of the motor. So what I did was I started by disconnecting the long tube headers. And if you don't have long tube headers, I don't think you actually have to take the manifolds out. Like if you've got the Z06 or the C6 manifolds, I think if you just break them at where the cats are up front, I think you'll have enough room. But what I found with my Cook's long tube header install was I couldn't get enough room around the bell housing to actually get everything out of the way. So I ended up having to climb a ladder, get all the way up in the air, remove the headers from the top, or loosen the bolts from the top, and then drop them out the bottom. Okay, after you have removed the long tube headers, you're going to want to remove the rest of the exhaust system. So you take out the high flow cats, the X pipe, and the mufflers themselves. These are all just 15 millimeter bolts, all held together. Just loosen everything out. Disconnect the O2 sensors. I had to get extension harnesses from a long time ago. Just unplug those. So unplug the sensors, pull everything out, and you'll get the exhaust out. I have a picture of that here. Then take the mufflers out. You do that by just disconnecting the 15mm bolt here. Then there's 2 hangers in the back that connect to the rear bumper. Take those 2 bolts out and the hangers will drop, and you'll be able to take the whole muffler out. You have to fish it out over the torque tube, over the transmission and differential, and because it's shaped like that, just pull it up and out and you'll be able to get the mufflers out. After you get the mufflers out, the next thing you're going to do is take off the torque tube tunnel plate. As you can see, there are like 40 of these 7mm bolts. I think they're 7mm, maybe that might be 8mm, but there's like 25 of these bolts on each side. Take them all out on both sides, and then you'll be able to get access to the torque tube. The reason you have to take out that torque tube trans tunnel plate is because the torque tube will be above it. Once you get all those bolts out, that tunnel brace will pop right out. Now I actually have an aftermarket one. This is from Elite Engineering, and it's thicker than the GM one, and it has a thermal plate, has a thermal coating on the bottom of it. Basically it's like a reflective heat foil, and that actually did help reduce interior temperatures on the inside, because the bad problem about the C6s are the cup holders actually become like cup warmers because of the stupid exhaust in the transmission, the torque tube. So adding that plate actually reduced the interior temperature just a little bit. So exhaust is out, torque tunnel plate is out. Now you can get started on the rest of the swap, rest of the removal. So you're gonna have plenty of room to get started in the back. What you're gonna want to do is actually take your transmission jack. I have a transmission jack from Big Red, or is it Torin? One of the two. I modify that jack. I'll have a link up right here to my modification of that jack to work with the Max jacks. And what I did was I cut about 12 inches of the jack out and re-drilled 4 holes in the bottom, and that gave me plenty of room to get under the car, push the transmission jack support all the way up, and then put the security chain around the transmission. So you can put the chain around the transmission, bolt it to the transmission jack, tighten everything down, and then you're going to be able to get started on the removal process. The next thing you're going to do is remove the tires. So your 5 bolts on each side, take the tires out, remove the tires and wheels. And the next thing you're going to do is actually disconnect the coilover or rear shocks, whatever setup you have. I happen to have, like I said, these are those FOT coilovers, and the company went out of business. So remove the bottom bolt. It's down here at the bottom. Remove the bottom bolt. There's 2 top bolts. Remove those, and you'll be able to get the coilover, fish it through the frame and out the bottom. It's going to be the same on both sides. So remove the coilover. There's 3 bolts, 2 up top, 1 at the bottom. Remove that. And once you get that out of the way, you'll be able to disconnect the upper A-arms. As you can see, the upper A-arm is all the way up top, and I think that's an 18mm bolt. I could be wrong, but just make sure you have full socket set with you. Remove the upper A-arm bolt, and there's going to be a bolt and nut. So grab a socket and your wrench, put the wrench on the nut side, and remove the bolts. So there's 2 bolts, 1, 2 up top. Remove those, and you're going to have the passenger side disconnected. It's going to be the same on the front, on the driver's side. See that bolt right there? Disconnect that all the way up there. Disconnect that, and the whole assembly will actually be able to swing down and out of the way. So you'll be able to swing the brakes and everything outward. So you'll have everything disconnected. We haven't touched the subframe bolts yet. That's kind of the last step. But the next thing you're going to want to do is actually disconnect the brake line. It might be kind of hard to see up there because the exhaust is in the way. See, this is why you take the exhaust out. You won't have any issue. You see that brake line right there? What you're going to do is disconnect that. And that's actually the main line coming from the chassis going to the rear subframe. So if you disconnect that one point, That's all you have to worry about. You don't have to disconnect the brake lines going to the rear brake calipers at all. Take that rear brake line off. Make sure you use a brake line tool for that. And then I actually have a picture to put here. What I used was I used a Brembo caliper plug. Put that on the chassis side. No, the blue caliper plug. Put that on the subframe side, and then use a closet. And then use a closet plug, like a closet end piece for a closet rack system, shelving system. I use that to actually plug the brake line coming from the chassis. I'll include a picture of that here. Disconnect the brake line, put those two plugs in, and that way you don't have brake fluid dripping everywhere. Okay, after you get that, now it's going to be time for the subframe. Now the subframe is just 4 bolts. No, that's transmission mount, I'm sorry. The subframe bolts are here. You're going to take the nut out because the bolts stay in the frame. I believe that's a 22mm nut. You're going to undo the 1, 2, 3, 4. The 4th one's back there. And you're going to disconnect that as well. So now you're able to get the whole assembly lower down. You can actually loosen it and drop it a little bit because those nuts have a solid inch of thread on there, so you could actually loosen them and loosen the whole rear end. Okay, now you're gonna have your rear subframe loose. What you need to do next, actually what you might want to do first is actually drain the transmission. There's a plug on the side, I think it's on the passenger driver's side. Yeah, there's a drain plug right here where it says it's above the use Dextron 3. That's a standard 3/8 wrench, or is it half? That might be 1/2 inch. Just put your wrench itself, no sockets. Put the male part into the threaded bolt here, and you'll just, righty tighty, lefty loosey. So back out the plug and drain the transmission. The reason you want to do that is because you're gonna have to you're gonna have to disconnect the transmission cooler. And you don't want ATF fluid going all over your garage. So drain your trans fluid, use a catch can, use a oil catch pan to do that. Drain that, and you'll be good to go. Now you don't have to do the rear diff, at least I don't, because I don't have a rear differential cooler. Actually, I think the rear differential cooler on the Z06 and the Z01, I think it uses actually transmission fluid to cool it off. Yeah, I think that's how that works. It's a weird setup, but I don't think you have to touch the diff fluid on a Z06 either. But so disconnect the brake lines, disconnect the transmission, drain the transmission. Then up front here, you're going to disconnect the transmission cooler. And the transmission cooler is just threaded on. Then it's held in with those E-clips like I was talking about earlier. Disconnect the E-clips and pull the transmission line out, like toward you. Pull it this way, and you'll be able to, and your transmission system will be fully ready to go to remove. So disconnect the trans cooler, drain the trans, disconnect the brake fluids. And that should be it for fluids. I'm pretty sure that's about it. So, oh, and also while you're up here, take the engine mount bolts out. There's nuts on the bottom, just like the subframe. Take these bolts off. That way you have plenty of room to swing the back of the motor towards you when you drop the rear trans tunnel, the transaxle. Okay, now we've gotten the suspension loose, all the fluids are drained, and you're ready to drop the subframe. Take those 4 bolts out in the back, like I said, and the whole assembly will come down onto the transmission jack. And so I'll have a picture here of me lowering the transaxle assembly onto the jack and down away from the body. Now, an important safety thing that you need to add is add a floor jack to support the front end. This is specific to the Max jacks, but this is a Greg Smith Equipment short, tall jack stand, or tall, short jack stand. It's a funny name, But what it is, this is basically a support stand to use under a full-size lift that they just cut the legs down shorter. They just, you know, they worked with the Chinese company to shorten the leg. And what you want to do is use this to support the front end, because what you're doing is you don't want the car, because what you're doing is you're moving all this weight from the ass end of the car. You don't want the car to tilt forward, because all of a sudden all the weight, you know, is shoved to the front of the car, and you don't want that heavy engine pushing the car forward, tilting it off the lift. So just an important safety thing to worry about, to add. So now, with everything lowered, you need to disconnect the wire harness. There is a reverse lockout plug on top of the transmission that you need to unplug. I unplugged mine, but I forgot to actually plug it back in when I put the car back together, and the car wouldn't go in reverse. So that's interesting. But there's 2 or 3 plugs along the transmission. There's also the plug on top for the reverse lockout, and I believe there's a plug for the back rear differential. You're going to unplug all of that, and then on top of the torque tube, there's these little metal aluminum like wire tabs that basically you just push the wire harness out from underneath, because it basically clips in. It doesn't clip in physically, but it holds it. There's no plastic clip or anything. It's just a metal clamp that you push the wire harness out of. There's going to be like 4 or 5 of those along the torque tube. Pull those out, and you'll actually get the harness separate from the torque tube. Pull the harness toward the front of the car, and you'll be able to get everything. You're now officially ready to disconnect the torque tube. Like I said, 4 or 5 bolts for the bell housing to torque tube bolts. Take those all out. And there's one also holding the slave cylinder. It's either to the bell housing or it's to the torque tube, the bell housing bolt. I'm not really sure where that bolt is. I don't see it. Actually, it's right there. So that's actually the bell housing, the torque tube. No, I'm sorry. So we don't need to worry about that. So now you're ready with the wire harness out of the way, the trans cooler disconnected, the rear suspension disconnected, and the subframe lowered and the bolts removed. You're able to actually remove the torque tube. Now, to remove the torque tube, there's 4 or 5 bolts. I think all these bolts are 13 millimeter. Yeah, that looks to be about a 13 millimeter. All of these bolts, including the bell housing, the engine block bolts, are 13 millimeter. Disconnect, remove all the bolts, and the torque tube will be fully disconnected from the bell housing, but you need to actually push. So what I did was I disconnected the wheel locks on my trans jack, and I just pushed the trans jack back. Like, I think I raised it back up a little bit, pushed it back, and I was able to get the input shaft out of the input bearing, out of the clutch, and out of the bell housing, and I got the whole assembly loose, you know, backwards. I'll have a picture now of the transaxle, the rear diff, the transmission, the torque tube, all as an assembly with the brake lines and all that attached on my trans jack. I'll include that now. And now what you're stuck with is the bell housing, the clutch. Thanks for watching my video. Don't forget to like it, and if you haven't already, please subscribe.